In 1973, a single Sunday morning changed everything for the quiet coastal city of Savannah, Georgia. What began as routine preparation for worship services at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church became one of the most audacious financial crimes in the region's history. By noon that day, nearly $4 million had vanished without a trace, leaving investigators with empty vaults, shattered glass, and absolutely no leads. No witnesses came forward. No fingerprints were recovered. No arrests were made. The case went cold within months, buried under paperwork and the passage of time, seemingly destined to remain one of Georgia's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. But in the summer of 2025, during what should have been a routine renovation of the church's basement fellowship hall, a construction crew made a discovery that would crack open a case the authorities had long since abandoned. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris, concealed behind a false wall that had gone unnoticed for over half a century, sat a rusted metal safe. What lay inside wouldn't be treasure, but it would be something far more valuable to investigators. It would be the first real clue in 52 years, a breadcrumb trail that would finally lead them back to a crime that had once seemed impossible to solve. The morning of September 23, 1973, dawned humid and overcast in Savannah's historic district. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, a stately brick structure dating back to the 1840s, stood quietly among the moss-draped oaks on Abercorn Street. The building had weathered the Civil War, 2 world wars, and countless hurricanes, serving as both a spiritual anchor and a community gathering place for generations of Savannah families. Its Gothic Revival architecture and towering spire made it a recognizable landmark. But what drew attention that particular Sunday had nothing to do with its historical significance. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The church had been selected as a temporary holding facility for a massive currency transfer orchestrated by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Due to ongoing construction at the main banking facility and security concerns about transporting such large sums during regular business hours, arrangements had been made to store the money overnight in the church's basement vault. The decision wasn't unprecedented. Churches had occasionally served as secure holding sites for government operations, their perceived sanctity and community trust making them unlikely targets for criminal activity. The currency shipment had arrived late Saturday evening under heavy escort. Federal marshals supervised the transfer of sealed canvas bags containing a mixture of old bills scheduled for destruction and new currency bound for regional banks throughout the Southeast. The total value, according to Treasury records, was exactly $3,947,200. The money was secured in a reinforced vault beneath the church's main sanctuary, a space originally designed to house important documents and ceremonial items. Additional security measures included motion detectors, a silent alarm system connected directly to the Savannah Police Department, and round-the-clock surveillance by 2 armed guards stationed in the church office. At approximately 6:15 that Sunday morning, Father William Caldwell arrived to prepare for the early service. The 58-year-old priest had served the congregation for nearly 2 decades and was known for his punctuality and attention to detail. He entered through the main doors using his personal key and immediately noticed that something felt wrong. The church was too quiet. The normal hum of the building's ventilation system was absent, and the usual sounds from the security guards' radio chatter couldn't be heard from the office area. Moving cautiously through the nave, Father Caldwell called out to the guards but received no response. When he reached the office, he found the door standing open and both guards missing. Their equipment remained at their posts, including loaded weapons and communication devices, but there were no signs of struggle or disturbance. The scene appeared almost staged in its orderliness, as if the men had simply walked away from their duties without explanation. Growing increasingly concerned, Father Caldwell made his way to the basement to check the vault. The heavy wooden door leading downstairs creaked as he descended, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The basement corridor was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, casting long shadows against the stone walls. When he reached the vault area, his worst fears were confirmed. The reinforced steel door hung open, its sophisticated locking mechanism intact but disengaged. Inside, the space was completely empty. The canvas bags that had contained nearly $4 million were gone. Not a single bill remained. Even more puzzling, there were no signs of forced entry, no damaged locks, no scattered debris to indicate hasty work. The vault appeared to have been opened with precision and emptied with methodical care. The only evidence of intrusion was the absence of what should have been there. Father Caldwell immediately contacted the police, and within minutes, patrol units converged on the church. The initial response was swift and thorough. Officers secured the perimeter, interviewed the priest, and began documenting the scene. The missing guards were located an hour later, found unconscious in a storage building 3 blocks away. Both men had been drugged with what medical examiners later identified as a fast-acting sedative, administered through injection sites on their necks. They had no memory of the events following their last radio check at midnight. The investigation that followed was extensive but ultimately fruitless. Federal agents joined local police in processing the scene, interviewing witnesses, and following up on potential leads. The church's alarm system had been disabled from the inside, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of its operation. The motion detectors had been carefully bypassed, not damaged or destroyed, indicating professional expertise. Most troubling of all, the vault's combination lock showed no signs of tampering, leading investigators to conclude that whoever opened it knew the correct sequence. A canvass of the neighborhood revealed no witnesses to unusual activity during the night. The church sat on a relatively quiet street, surrounded by other historic buildings and residential properties. Most residents had been asleep during the crucial hours, and those few who were awake reported nothing suspicious. No vehicles were seen arriving or departing from the church grounds. No unfamiliar figures were spotted in the area, and no sounds of disturbance were heard. The list of people with access to the vault's combination was remarkably short. Besides Father Caldwell himself, only 3 individuals knew the 6-digit sequence. Federal agents had provided the combination to 2 senior church officials earlier that week, and the vault's manufacturer had retained a master code for emergency access. Each person was thoroughly investigated, their whereabouts verified, and their background scrutinized for any connection to criminal activity. All were cleared of suspicion. As weeks turned to months, the investigation began to lose momentum. Despite offering substantial rewards for information and following hundreds of tips from the public, authorities made no significant progress. The stolen currency, marked with specific serial numbers, never surfaced in circulation. No suspicious deposits were made to area banks, no unusual purchases were reported by local businesses, and no informants came forward with credible information about the crime's perpetrators. The case file grew thick with reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses, but it contained no answers. By the end of 1974, active investigation had effectively ceased. The Federal Reserve wrote off the loss, insurance claims were processed, and the church installed new security measures. St. Matthew's returned to its quiet role as a community gathering place, though the events of that September morning had left an indelible mark on both the congregation and the city's collective memory. For decades that followed, the great church heist became local legend, a story passed down through families and discussed in coffee shops and bar rooms throughout Savannah. Some believed the perpetrators had been professional criminals from out of state who had vanished with their prize. Others suspected an inside job involving corrupt officials or church members. A few maintained that the money had never left the building, hidden somewhere within the church's maze of basements, attic spaces, and forgotten rooms. As the years passed, the investigation officially remained open but dormant. Detective files gathered dust in storage rooms, and the federal agents who had worked the case moved on to other assignments or retired. The church itself underwent several renovations and leadership changes, but the basement vault was permanently sealed and converted into storage space for seasonal decorations and archived records. The heavy steel door that had once protected millions of dollars now secured boxes of Christmas ornaments and old hymnals. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, occasional newspaper articles would revisit the unsolved crime, usually around anniversaries or when similar heists occurred elsewhere. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators would sometimes visit Savannah, drawn by the mystery and the substantial sum that had never been recovered. They would walk the grounds of St. Matthew's, photograph the building from every angle, and theorize about how such a sophisticated operation could have been executed without leaving a single useful clue. The church congregation gradually grew accustomed to their building's notoriety. Tour guides would point out the historic structure to visitors, often mentioning the infamous robbery as part of Savannah's colorful criminal history. Father Caldwell, who had discovered the empty vault that September morning, served the parish for another 15 years before retiring. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident, but those close to him knew it had profoundly affected his sense of security and trust. During the late 1990s, advances in forensic technology prompted a brief, renewed interest in the case. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation re-examined physical evidence using DNA testing and enhanced fingerprint analysis techniques that hadn't existed in 1973. Hair fibers found in the vault area were tested. Dust particles were analyzed for foreign substances, and every surface was reprocessed for latent prints. The results yielded nothing useful. Whatever trace evidence the perpetrators might have left behind had either degraded beyond recognition or been contaminated by decades of subsequent activity in the building. Computer databases were searched for patterns matching the crime's methodology. Investigators looked for similar heists involving churches, federal currency, and inside knowledge of security systems. They cross-referenced known criminals with the skills necessary to disable alarm systems and open sophisticated locks. They analyzed bank records from the period, searching for unusual transactions or deposits that might indicate laundered proceeds. Every lead reached the same dead end. By the turn of the millennium, the case had achieved a kind of mythical status in law enforcement circles. It was studied in training academies as an example of a perfect crime, one where every security measure had been anticipated and countered. Criminology students wrote papers about it, and retired investigators would reference it when discussing cases that defied solution. The consensus among professionals was that whoever had planned the heist possessed exceptional skills, extensive inside knowledge, and remarkable discipline in avoiding detection. The money itself became a subject of endless speculation. Financial experts calculated that the 1973 sum would be worth over $20 million in modern currency, adjusted for inflation. If the perpetrators had invested their proceeds wisely, they could have built substantial fortunes over the intervening decades. Yet, despite this incentive, no deathbed confessions emerged, no family members came forward with suspicious inheritance stories, and no evidence surfaced suggesting the currency had ever entered legitimate financial channels. Some investigators theorized that the stolen bills had been destroyed, either accidentally or intentionally, to avoid the risk of detection through serial number tracking. Others believed the money had been moved out of the country immediately after the theft, perhaps to offshore accounts or foreign banks with less stringent reporting requirements. A few maintained that the proceeds remained hidden somewhere in the Savannah area, waiting to be discovered by accident or design. The church building itself underwent numerous modifications over the years. The basement was expanded and reconfigured multiple times to accommodate growing community programs and changing needs. Walls were added and removed, utility lines were rerouted, and storage areas were reorganized. Each renovation brought the possibility that construction workers might stumble upon some overlooked clue or hidden cache, but nothing related to the 1973 robbery ever surfaced. In 2015, St. Matthew's launched an ambitious restoration project aimed at preserving the building's historic character while updating its facilities for modern use. The work required extensive excavation around the foundation and complete renovation of the basement level. Contractors found the usual artifacts of a building's long history: fragments of old plumbing, discarded construction materials, and forgotten personal items left behind by previous generations. But nothing connected to the great heist emerged from the renovated spaces. The project stalled several times due to funding shortages and permit delays. What had been planned as a 2-year effort stretched into nearly a decade of intermittent work. Different contractors took over various phases, and the church leadership changed hands twice during the extended renovation period. By 2024, much of the restoration was complete, but the fellowship hall in the basement remained unfinished, its renovation repeatedly postponed due to budget constraints and structural complications. Father Michael Torres, who had assumed leadership of the congregation in 2019, was determined to complete the project before the church's 180th anniversary celebration planned for 2026. An energetic man in his early 40s, Torres had grown up hearing stories about the famous robbery and was fascinated by the unsolved mystery. Unlike his predecessors who had preferred to downplay the church's criminal notoriety, Torres embraced the history as part of the building's unique character. In early 2025, Torres secured grants and donations sufficient to finish the fellowship hall renovation. The work required removing several walls that had been added over the years, some dating back to the 1980s, others installed during previous renovation attempts. The space had become a maze of small rooms and storage closets, none of which served the community functions Torres envisioned for the completed hall. The contractor selected for the final phase was Coleman Brothers Construction, a local family business with extensive experience in historic preservation. The 3 Coleman siblings had worked on dozens of Savannah's antebellum buildings and understood the challenges of renovating structures that had been modified repeatedly over many decades. They approached each project with careful attention to architectural integrity and historical accuracy. The demolition phase began in June 2025, with workers systematically removing partition walls and non-structural elements that had cluttered the basement over the years. The process revealed the building's original layout and exposed brick walls that hadn't been seen in decades. It was slow, meticulous work, complicated by the need to preserve historic materials and identify any structural elements that might be significant to the building's heritage. On July 18, 2025, crew foreman Danny Coleman was supervising the removal of a wall that separated 2 small storage rooms in the northeast corner of the basement. The wall appeared to have been built sometime in the 1970s, constructed with materials and techniques that suggested hasty, temporary installation rather than professional craftsmanship. As workers began dismantling the drywall panels, Coleman noticed an irregularity in the wall's thickness that didn't match the building's architectural plans. Behind the false section, concealed in a narrow cavity that had been deliberately walled off from view, sat a small metal safe. The discovery sent ripples of excitement through the renovation crew. Coleman immediately halted work and contacted Father Torres, who arrived within minutes to examine the find. The safe was compact, roughly the size of a briefcase, with a combination lock that showed decades of rust and corrosion. Its placement suggested it had been hidden intentionally, tucked into a space that would have required specific knowledge of the building's layout to access. Father Torres recognized the potential significance immediately. The timing aligned perfectly with the 1973 robbery, and the location in the basement placed it within the same general area where the original vault had been situated. Rather than attempting to open the safe themselves, Torres made the decision to contact the Savannah Police Department and report the discovery as potentially connected to the unsolved federal crime. Detective Sarah Chen of the SPD's Cold Case Unit responded to the call. Chen had been with the department for 12 years, specializing in cases that had gone dormant due to lack of evidence or leads. She was familiar with the church robbery from departmental lore and training materials, though she had never expected to work on it actively. The discovery of the hidden safe represented the first new development in the case since the early 1980s. The safe was carefully extracted from its hiding place and transported to the police station for examination. A locksmith specializing in antique security devices was brought in to assess the mechanism and determine the best method for opening it without destroying potential evidence inside. The combination lock was severely corroded, its dial barely functional after decades of basement humidity and neglect. After consulting with federal authorities and obtaining proper search warrants, the safe was opened under controlled conditions with multiple agencies present. Inside, investigators found not money or valuables, but something potentially more valuable to the investigation. The safe contained a collection of documents, photographs, and personal items that appeared to date from the early 1970s. Among the contents were handwritten notes detailing the church's security procedures, including alarm codes and guard schedules from the period leading up to the robbery. There were photographs of the church's interior, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been inside the building multiple times. Most significantly, there were detailed floor plans of the basement level, annotated with notes about structural modifications and potential hiding places. One document stood out immediately. It was a letter written on church letterhead, dated August 15, 1973, just weeks before the robbery. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as M and contained what appeared to be final instructions for an unnamed operation. The handwriting was neat and precise, suggesting education and careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. The letter referenced specific times, locations, and procedures that aligned perfectly with the known details of the robbery. It mentioned the federal currency transfer, the temporary security arrangements, and even the guards' shift rotations. Most intriguingly, it contained information that had never been made public, details that only someone with intimate access to the planning process could have known. Detective Chen immediately began the process of analyzing the documents for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and handwriting comparison. The paper had aged considerably, but preservation in the sealed safe had protected it from the worst effects of moisture and deterioration. Forensic specialists were optimistic that usable evidence could be extracted from the materials. The photographs found in the safe were particularly revealing. They showed various areas of the church that would have been relevant to planning the robbery, including multiple angles of the basement vault, the main entrances, and sight lines from nearby buildings. The images had been taken with a professional quality camera and demonstrated a thorough reconnaissance of the target location. One photograph showed a man standing near the church's side entrance, apparently unaware that he was being photographed. The image quality was poor due to age and storage conditions, but facial recognition software was employed to compare the figure against databases of known criminals from the 1970s era. The process would take weeks to complete, but it represented the first potential visual evidence of someone connected to the crime. The handwritten notes were equally enlightening. They contained observations about the church's daily routines, the habits of staff members, and the timing of various activities that would have been crucial to avoiding detection. The level of detail suggested months of careful surveillance and planning, contradicting earlier theories that the robbery had been an opportunistic crime. One note referenced the priest's morning routine, with specific times and behaviors that matched Father Caldwell's known schedule from 1973. Another detailed the church's cleaning schedule and identified periods when the building would be empty and unmonitored. The information was so precise that investigators concluded the author had either spent considerable time observing the church or had received detailed intelligence from someone with regular access to the building. Perhaps most significantly, the documents contained references to 3 individuals identified only by initials. The letters M, R, and D appeared repeatedly in various contexts, suggesting a 3-person operation with specific role assignments. The notes indicated that M was responsible for technical aspects like alarm systems and locks, R handled surveillance and planning, and D managed logistics and transportation. The discovery prompted a full reopening of the case with resources that had been unavailable in 1973. Modern forensic techniques were applied to all the newly found evidence, and computer databases were searched for patterns that might identify the mysterious individuals referenced in the documents. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to develop psychological profiles of the perpetrators based on their planning methods and operational approach. Handwriting analysis revealed that all the documents had been written by the same person, suggesting that one individual had served as the primary planner and coordinator for the operation. The writing style indicated education and methodical thinking, supporting the theory that the robbery had been executed by sophisticated criminals rather than desperate amateurs. DNA testing of the documents yielded partial genetic profiles that were entered into national databases for comparison. While the degraded condition of the samples limited their usefulness, forensic specialists remained hopeful that advances in DNA analysis technology might eventually produce more definitive results. The investigation also focused on the safe itself. The manufacturer's markings indicated it had been produced in the late 1960s by a company that had specialized in residential security products. Sales records from the era were located and examined, though the passage of time had made many documents incomplete or illegible. The goal was to trace the safe's original purchase and determine how it had ended up hidden in the church basement. Detective Chen interviewed retired police officers who had worked on the original investigation, seeking insights that might not have been documented in official reports. Several former investigators recalled details about potential suspects who had been questioned but never charged. Names that had been forgotten for decades were suddenly relevant again, and Chen began the process of tracking down individuals who might still be alive and available for questioning. The church's historical records were also re-examined with fresh eyes. Membership rolls, volunteer lists, and financial records from the early 1970s were scrutinized for connections to the newly discovered evidence. The goal was to identify anyone who might have had both the access necessary to gather intelligence about the church's operations and the criminal connections required to execute such a sophisticated heist. Father Torres cooperated fully with the renewed investigation, providing access to any church records that might be relevant. He also authorized a complete search of the building using ground-penetrating radar and other modern detection equipment. The possibility remained that additional evidence or even the stolen money itself might still be hidden somewhere within the church's walls or foundation. The media attention surrounding the discovery was intense, but carefully managed by law enforcement. While the general public was informed about the safe's discovery and the reopening of the case, specific details about the document's contents were withheld to protect the integrity of the investigation. The hope was that publicity might prompt additional witnesses or informants to come forward with information that had been suppressed for decades. Local historians and genealogists volunteered to assist with research into the church's past, offering to examine family records and community documents that might shed light on who had access to the building during the relevant time period. The collaborative approach reflected the community's continued fascination with the unsolved crime and their desire to finally see it resolved. As autumn approached, the investigation had generated dozens of new leads and potential connections. For the first time in over 50 years, investigators felt they were making genuine progress toward solving one of Georgia's most notorious unsolved crimes. The hidden safe had provided the breakthrough that decades of traditional police work had failed to achieve, proving that sometimes the key to solving an old mystery lay not in new techniques, but in new discoveries of old evidence. The renovation of St. Matthew's Fellowship Hall continued around the ongoing investigation, with workers carefully documenting every aspect of the basement's original construction. Additional hidden spaces were discovered during the process, though none contained evidence as significant as the concealed safe. Each new revelation added pieces to a puzzle that investigators were finally beginning to understand, bringing them closer to answering questions that had haunted Savannah for more than half a century. The breakthrough came in November 2025, when forensic genealogists working with Detective Chen made a connection that had eluded investigators for decades. Using DNA samples extracted from the documents found in the safe, they identified a familial match in a public genealogy database. The profile belonged to a woman in her 70s living in Charleston, South Carolina, whose genetic markers indicated she was likely related to whoever had handled the hidden papers. Margaret Whitfield had submitted her DNA to trace her family ancestry, never imagining it would connect her to one of the South's most infamous unsolved crimes. When Chen contacted her, Whitfield initially expressed confusion about any potential connection to the church robbery. But as the detective explained the genetic evidence, a troubling realization began to emerge. Whitfield's older brother, Robert, had worked as a security consultant in the Savannah area during the early 1970s. She remembered him visiting the family frequently during that period, often carrying large amounts of cash that he claimed came from legitimate consulting contracts. Robert had been secretive about his work, telling family members only that he specialized in evaluating security systems for businesses and institutions. The timing aligned perfectly with the church robbery. According to Whitfield, her brother had abruptly left Georgia in late September 1973, just days after the heist occurred. He had told the family he was relocating to Florida for a new job opportunity, but he had maintained minimal contact afterward. Robert Whitfield died in 1998, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. Detective Chen immediately began investigating Robert Whitfield's background and discovered a complex individual with the skills and connections necessary to execute the church heist. Military records showed he had served in the Army Corps of Engineers during the Vietnam era, receiving specialized training in demolitions and security systems. After his discharge, he had worked for several private security firms before establishing his own consulting practice in 1971. Most significantly, church records revealed that Whitfield's company had been hired by St. Matthew's in early 1973 to evaluate their security systems in preparation for hosting the federal currency transfer. The contract had given him complete access to the building's layout, alarm systems, and security protocols. He had spent weeks inside the church, ostensibly conducting his assessment, but apparently also gathering the intelligence necessary to plan the robbery. The connection explained how the perpetrators had possessed such detailed knowledge of the church's operations. Whitfield hadn't been an outsider casing the target. He had been invited inside as a trusted professional, given access to every aspect of the security arrangements he would later exploit. The irony was profound. The church had hired the very man who would orchestrate its victimization. Further investigation revealed that Whitfield had maintained relationships with several individuals who matched the initials found in the hidden documents. Military records showed he had served with men named Michael Dobson and David Reynolds, both of whom had received similar technical training and had worked in security-related fields after their discharge. All three had settled in the Southeast following their military service. The FBI traced Dobson to a 1979 arrest in Miami for attempting to sell stolen government bonds. He had died in federal prison in 1984, serving a sentence for that unrelated crime. Reynolds had disappeared from official records in the mid-1970s, with no death certificate or subsequent documentation of his whereabouts. Investigators theorized that he might have assumed a new identity or left the country entirely. The pattern suggested a three-man operation exactly as the hidden documents had indicated. Whitfield, with his security expertise and legitimate access to the church, had served as the planner and inside man. Dobson had likely handled the technical aspects of disabling alarms and opening the vault. Reynolds had probably managed logistics and transportation, ensuring the stolen currency could be moved and hidden without detection. What remained unclear was the ultimate fate of the nearly $4 million that had vanished that September morning. Bank records from the 1970s were incomplete, and the techniques used to track money laundering were primitive by modern standards. If the perpetrators had been patient and disciplined, they could have gradually introduced the stolen currency into legitimate financial channels without triggering suspicion. Detective Chen's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered that Robert Whitfield had purchased a substantial property in rural South Carolina just months after the church robbery. The land transaction, conducted through a series of intermediaries and shell companies, had involved a cash payment of nearly $200,000. For a security consultant working small contracts, such a purchase represented resources far beyond his apparent legitimate income. The property, located in a remote area of Beaufort County, consisted of over 300 acres of undeveloped woodland. Whitfield had held the land until his death, never building on it or attempting to develop it commercially. His estate had sold the property in 2001, but the new owners had made no significant modifications to the land. Chen obtained search warrants and organized a comprehensive examination of the former Whitfield property, using ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and cadaver dogs. The search took weeks and covered hundreds of acres of dense forest and swampland. The team was looking for anything that might indicate buried currency, hidden safes, or other evidence related to the 1973 robbery. The breakthrough came near a small creek that ran through the property's eastern boundary. Radar imaging detected several large metallic objects buried approximately 6 feet below the surface, in an area that showed signs of having been disturbed decades earlier. Careful excavation revealed 3 waterproof containers, each roughly the size of a footlocker, buried in precise alignment and covered with concrete slabs. Inside the containers, investigators found the remnants of what had once been millions of dollars in currency. Time, moisture, and insects had destroyed most of the bills, reducing them to fragments and residue that could barely be identified as once having been money. However, enough serial numbers remained legible to confirm that these were indeed bills from the 1973 federal shipment stolen from St. Matthew's Church. The discovery provided definitive proof that the newly reopened investigation had identified the correct perpetrators. It also explained why the stolen currency had never surfaced in circulation. Rather than attempting to spend or launder the money immediately, the thieves had buried it with the intention of retrieving it later when the heat from the investigation had died down. The burial site's location suggested that the plan had been more sophisticated than simple theft and immediate flight. The remote property provided an ideal hiding place where the money could remain concealed for years if necessary. The waterproof containers and concrete coverings indicated long-term thinking and careful preparation for extended storage. But something had gone wrong with the recovery plan. Whether due to death, imprisonment, or simply fear of detection, none of the perpetrators had ever returned to claim their buried treasure. The millions of dollars that had been the object of one of Georgia's most notorious crimes had slowly decomposed in the South Carolina wilderness, ultimately becoming worthless despite the perfect execution of the theft itself. The revelation brought a mixture of satisfaction and irony to the conclusion of the case. After 52 years, investigators had finally identified the perpetrators, located the stolen money, and solved one of the region's most enduring mysteries. Yet, the resolution also highlighted the ultimate futility of the crime. The sophisticated planning, technical expertise, and careful execution had all been for nothing. The money that had cost careers, consumed resources, and generated decades of speculation had simply rotted away in the ground. Detective Chen closed the case file in December 2025, marking it as solved through investigation despite the inability to prosecute the deceased perpetrators. The church safe that had launched the renewed investigation was donated to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Training Academy, where it would be used to teach future investigators about the importance of following every lead, no matter how old or unlikely it might seem. Father Torres completed the fellowship hall renovation in early 2026, incorporating a small display case that documented the church's unique role in criminal history. Rather than hiding from the notorious past, the congregation chose to embrace it as part of their story, a reminder that even the most sacred spaces could become entangled in human failings, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through persistence and modern investigative techniques. The case of the 1973 St. Matthew's Church robbery had finally been closed, not through brilliant detective work or dramatic confessions, but through the patient accumulation of evidence and the power of modern forensic science applied to forgotten clues. A hidden safe, a church renovation, and advances in DNA analysis had combined to solve a mystery that had puzzled investigators for over half a century, proving that in criminal justice, as in faith, some truths are only revealed through time.